Well, some breaking news out of the U.S. right now. A tell-all book by the former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton. Well, it can be published. That ruling coming down from a U.S. federal judge who says the Trump administration's attempt to block the release would not have been an appropriate solution. This, as many details have already been revealed in the book. The judge also calling Bolton's conduct a grave national security concern. The book is called The Room Where It Happened, and it is an insider's account of Bolton's time in the White House, the administration that now accuses him of revealing classified information. Well, for more on John Bolton's forthcoming book, we're now joined by Julia Manchester, she being the political reporter for The Hill. She joins us right now via Skype in Orlando, Florida. So, Julia, thank you for joining us once again.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
So, as this morning began, obviously we were in the midst of the White House trying to block this book from actually being widely released. But now, as we say, a judge has said the book can go forward. So what's your initial reaction to this ruling about John Bolton's book?
Well, obviously not great news for the White House. On Twitter, you're seeing a lot of White House communications staffers picking apart that statement you just read, saying that the judge still ruled there were grave national security concerns, but this book is still going to get out. And I think President Trump is very concerned about how this makes his image look personally ahead of the general election in November. It's interesting. Earlier this week, President Trump tweeted that the book is filled with lies. However, the Justice Department, in their bid to prevent it from being published, essentially said that there was classified information there. So two kind of contradictory messages, but that doesn't seem to matter anymore because we still see the book will get into the hands of many Americans eager to read it.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they can make their own judgments based on what they read. But you say this book can be potentially damaging because obviously it's not the first book to come from a Washington insider that paints this unflattering picture of Donald Trump. But how is John Bolton's book potentially the most damaging in your opinion?
I would say because he's a very good source in all of this. Remember, a lot of these books were from people who might have been in the White House orbit or connected to the president in some way, but in part of the pun, they weren't in the room where it happened. Remember, John Bolton had a front row seat to a lot of these conversations and actions that are taking place in this book. John Bolton is also someone who is very greatly revered within conservative circles, probably once revered by many of Trump's greatest supporters, obviously not anymore. So he is someone that people will definitely be looking at. Now, it's interesting to see the Democratic reaction to this book because John Bolton is obviously no popular figure in Democratic and liberal circles. However, they are touting a lot of these claims in here essentially in an effort to attack the president. But it's interesting because Bolton did not testify during the impeachment proceedings when he was called to do so. Mm-hmm. So that bringing back a lot of criticism from Democrats.
Well, listen, I want to touch on that point in a moment, but I think for people who've not been able to read any of the advanced copies or even any of the stories around it right now, what are the allegations that stand out the most to you?
Well, I would say the biggest allegation from an American perspective is President Trump asking China, or allegedly asking China's leadership to help him interfere in the 2020 elections, help him maybe turn the tides in his favor. We know that election interference has been a huge issue in this country. Really, that's the root of the Russia investigation that really overtook a lot of Washington over the past couple of years. But from a Canadian perspective, and this may not be much of a surprise, but it does say that President Trump was never a fan of Prime Minister Trudeau and that he actually asked a lot of his staffers to attack Prime Minister Trudeau on TV. We know that there has been tension between the two leaders. However, I guess we didn't know that it stemmed that deeply and that he was actually to forge some sort of public relations campaign against the prime minister, according to Bolton.
Mm-hmm. What about Ukraine, though, that famous phone call, because that's what the title refers to in the book. Does Bolton prove what Democrats were trying to prove, that Trump was trying to use outside agents to influence an American election?
I think a lot of, like I said, that is something that Democrats are very much talking about and touting this morning. But at the same time, I think there was a tweet earlier this week from House Intelligence Chairman Adam Schiff, who really led the impeachment probe in the House. And he said, John Bolton may be an author, but he's not a patriot. He didn't come and testify when we asked him to during these proceedings. So I think that definitely sums up a lot of the frustration among Democrats this morning. At the same time, the timing of this book is interesting because it's ahead of an election.
Yeah, so why didn't Bolton testify during the impeachment process? Because he is being criticized right now. Many people calling this book basically a money grab on his part.
I think it's hard to say. It might have been some sort of a PR move. He didn't necessarily, he might have wanted to wait until the right moment ahead of the election. He didn't want to align himself too much with Democrats, but he has argued that there were other offenses in this book that would have been more impeachable than that phone call or the interference, election interference claim. So I think that might have something to do with that, according to Bolton.
Less than a minute here, but I do want to ask you, Julia, because here we are talking about this book. It's going to be released on Monday, basically as Trump prepares for a big rally in Tulsa. Will any of this have any impact on the upcoming presidential election?
I don't think so, at least not with President Trump's base. President Trump's base has stuck with him through thick and thin. We know that John Bolton is very much of an inside Washington figure. President Trump is not. That's what makes him appealing. And we know, Michael, as you know, the news cycle moves so quickly these days. We don't know what we'll be talking about ahead of November. I think the pandemic and also a lot of these conversations about racial injustice will be much more on the forefront of Americans' minds come November.
Julia, always so good to speak with you. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
And that is Julia Manchester, political reporter for The Hill.